Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to my channel. And I want to thank you all for being here. Those of you who come regularly, I appreciate it. I have probably lots that I want to talk about that has absolutely nothing to do with what the topic is for tonight. I'll try to refrain myself a little bit. But little news I want to tell you about. We're getting some theme music put together. I'm going to start upping the feel of this whole broadcast to be back as if it were the regular broadcast I used to do, rather than just doing some readings and doing some lessons and things like that, doing some studies like this. I spend most of my time on the radio with Rocky Stucci, as you know, on the Situation Room, which there is not one tonight because while it may still be Friday night here in the Midwest, it is Saturday morning out east. And the Situation Room goes Monday through Friday, Eastern Standard Time. We launch at midnight every night. So we actually go, what would be everybody's in the Midwest, your Sunday night is actually Monday morning. So that's the Monday show. So we go Monday through Friday, but technically it's Sunday night through Thursday night, depending on where you are. So there's no Rocky Stucci show tonight. It's the weekend for there. It's actually early Saturday morning by the time we do the Situation Room right now. So you won't see us there tonight. I just want to give a quick announcement. The 20% off sale is over on Etsy. But you can still go over and avail yourself of stuff. Go to streamingtalkradio.com. And that's Rocky Stucci's channel, my channel. Everybody that does Jeff is going to be on there. And also the Professor Bauer, a few other people that we are linked with and network with. And you can go over to Streaming Talk Radio. And we're rebuilding that right now, as a matter of fact, as Rocky has mentioned several times. And so it's going to be a big, beautiful, flashy new site. Hopefully within a week or so, that'll be all up and ready to go. Rocky Stucci. I see Rocky's in the room. Everybody shut up. Good to see you, brother. And Susie Q, good to see you. James, good to see you, brother. And I'm just going to blether a little bit until we get the room a little more full, and we'll get rolling. Although, if you miss any part of this, or miss an episode, you can obviously come right back within an hour. I think usually it is set in the archives on YouTube, and you can take a look at any of the shows that we've done, any of the programs. I've got, I believe, over 100 videos of this kind of stuff right here on this channel. Be sure to like this video down below the screen here. I appreciate that. And if you're not subscribed, well, you probably wouldn't be here. Unless you're visiting, go ahead and subscribe. Hit that little bell button. Philip Blair, good to see you, brother. Holly, nice to see you. Michelle and Delaney's Delight Jones, good to see you as well. And I see you're all starting to stack up. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And, there's one thing I want to talk about. When I don't get to do the Situation Room with Rocky, especially now because it's late Friday night, early Saturday, so there is no sit room tonight. There are things that really set me off politically, and I hate to, maybe I shouldn't say it that way, because then it sounds like I'm a pissy broadcaster, that I broadcast the things that make me pissy about politics. But as you've heard Rocky say too, and we say this together, there are times we got to step away from it. And that's why usually the Friday night show last night is something very different than the rest of the week. We do paranormal, we do stuff like that to get ourselves away from the politics, which just blow our minds sometimes. And it gets really old. But there's something that really bothered me today, politically speaking. And that was when, now I don't know what political affiliation you all are. I think all by now, y'all know I'm pretty conservative. Even though I don't claim to be a Republican, I always tell people I am a small c conservative with a libertarian bent and a constitutional scholar, a constitutional originalist in its intent. And so pretty much that makes me kind of a Jeffersonian liberal. So you can sort that all out and figure out what you think I am. Just mark it down that I'm fairly conservative. And there was a thing here that in the news from early this morning where a Democratic House members, you'll know these names, Tlaib, and she's the, I think that's how you pronounce it, Tlaib. She is Rashida Tlaib, representative from Michigan. And you also have Representative Ayanna Pressley, and she's a Democrat from Massachusetts. And they came out slamming the Declaration of Independence. And now these are supposedly, well, not supposedly, they're American citizens, and yet they are in our government. They are representatives in our government, representatives of the people, and they came out really tearing into the Constitution. I'm sorry, the Independence, because yesterday was Independence Day, and I don't care what you did with the whole military parade and Trump's speech yesterday. I happened to watch this speech, and it was really good. And I got to tell you, Rocky's in the room. He knows me pretty well, and some of you do too. There were parts of that speech that brought tears to my eyes, and they might be things that don't affect you the same way. But I have this thing when there is a deep love for country, a deep love for our veterans, a deep love for the sacrifices they made, that can hit me pretty tight in my heart, and it'll set me off right away. And so I was listening last night. Yeah, Philibert Tlaib. I think that's how it's pronounced. Tlaib. It's Tlaib is the way it's spelled. So, yeah, that is a hell of a description. There's my politics for you. And I even get accused sometimes by my own kinfolk that I'm just an old white guy from Wisconsin. And so my views, even by people who are loved ones of mine, I know that love me and that I love them, that might be more on a liberal bent. They tend to think that my views don't really count that much because I'm too set in my ways and I'm just an old guy who likes to bluster about politics. And I say, if you think I'm just an old white guy from Wisconsin, I actually said to one of my relatives, I said, you know what? I said, I have believed what I believe politically and acted that way for longer than you've been alive, almost twice the number of years you've been alive. So I said, I think I'm a little more tried, a little more staid, and I still have questions. Not perfect, but I think I've pretty much settled on common sense. Hey, Suze. Hey, Becky. And good to see you. Becky, I meant, not Suze. So good to see you. And let's see what else we got going on. Hold on a second here. Delaney, just a black conservative from Delavan, Wisconsin. Well, you're pretty close to me, Delaney. So I'm glad to hear you've got a conservative bent. To me, I got to tell you, there is a bias of sorts with me, because when I see somebody say they're conservative, that generally speaks to me on a more common sense level, meaning you're not so driven by your emotions as you are driven by common sense when it comes to politics. You'll see, by the way, if you get to my Etsy page to see some of the shirts we've got up, I just did one today. It's that quote that I like to quote so often from, it's from John Adams. He said, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." And I've used that more than not lately. I use it as a hashtag. Hashtag facts don't care about your feelings. Two, hashtag facts over feelings. Hashtag three, hashtag substance or symbolism over substance. Substance over symbolism, the other way around. And so that's what I appreciate about people who are conservative. Not that you don't think, not that you can't think outside the box, not that you aren't open to change and aren't open to learning new things. We all are. And I'm talking about common sense people, but like Rocky and I had as our tagline for our radio show a long time ago. It was we're never smarter than common sense. So we try to boil things down to common sense. And if I'm wrong about something or take a wrong position, I like to think I'm big enough to admit that. But you will find that I will fight for my position. If you think my position's wrong, prove me otherwise, especially if you're going to debate me on it. Now, again, a very well-known author today, and I, especially in the fields that I've done of ancient origins and some of the mysterious things and metaphysics and things like that, we get into it quite often. And nothing mad at each other. He and his wife and I are very dear friends. He and I are dear friends. I love them dearly. But we got into it today over race issues and things like that, and the whole Constitution thing. This person posted a picture yesterday of, I think it was Mussolini in World War II looking over his military parade. And I think his headline for that was something like, "You are never more like a Russian vassal state than when you have a military parade," or something to that effect. And so we started communicating. I said, "Boy, that is so wrong-headed." And I usually don't come out the box swinging like that. I try to be diplomatic. I try to be friendly. I try to be fun. Somebody else was talking about the new Little Mermaid live action movie that they're going to be doing. And this was all with my daughters posted about it because, of course, if you know my daughters, they're very successful entrepreneurs. And 8 years ago, they started this mermaid tail business. And now they are just doing phenomenally well and better than their old man ever did. And but they've got a lot of followers. They've got 400,000 followers on the internet between all their social medias and all of that. And they're very successful at what they do. And they were talking about The Little Mermaid and how they have cast a black actress to play Ariel. Now, if you know The Little Mermaid from when we were all a little younger, way back, that movie came out before my now 27-year-old twin daughters were even born. So what did that come out about 28 years ago, almost 30 years ago? Seems hard to believe. But the little red-headed mermaid. And of course, now they've hired cast a black actress to play that. And she's gorgeous. She's got a beautiful singing voice. I don't know what they're going to do with her look and all of that, but my daughters put up something about, "Hey, isn't this wonderful? It's about time that they cast," and everybody was saying, "It's about time they cast a black actress in the role of the Little Mermaid." And I said, everybody was expressing their opinion, and I said, I'm disappointed by that. I said, not because it is a black actress, but because I'm a purist. I love the original. I love the classics. I said, for me, that would be like, it was like when they recast roles like, do you remember, if you were old like me, I grew up watching in the late 60s, the early 70s, the show The Wild Wild West with Robert Conrad. And I may have mentioned this last night. I'm just getting deja vu on it. And they recast the role with Will Smith, who I love. Will Smith. I love almost everything he does as far as movies go. And yet I was disappointed because I said, it's not a race issue as in racist issue. It's only race so far as when I said James West, ancient James West, post-Civil War, working as a special agent undercover for the government. He in cowboy land, I said he was a white guy. He wasn't a black guy. And when they changed him to a black guy for the sake of a vehicle for Will Smith's comedy, it was a fun movie. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't the same character to me. Because I was too distracted, not by the creativity of it, but it would be like, I don't know, remaking Casablanca and Rick Blaine becomes, I don't know, a Bolivian man. It doesn't work for me because Rick Blaine was a hard-boiled, New York white guy, mercenary, all of these things. So there's all these things that I tend to have problems with some of the changes. And for me, I'm a creative, so I had a problem with some of the creative issue in that. And I got to tell you, when I voiced my opinion with a bunch of young liberals, young liberal progressives, all I got told over and over and over again was what a racist I was. I can't believe that you were against them casting a black actress. Are you racist? Don't you think it? Oh, wait, hold it. Take it back a step, I'd say. You know what? I said, I'm not against them casting a black actress. I'm against them changing the character. Oh, well, she's just because she has dark toned skin, then you don't like it. I go, why? You guys are really digging for something here. I said, no, that is not the reasoning. And it goes on and on and on. Who does great blackface? Will Smith? He's black. Oh, Robert Downey. Yeah, that movie. I remember that. So what struck home to me with that whole scenario with a bunch of younger people who, the whole Little Mermaid thing, is that most of them there were liberal progressive, and they couldn't believe that I would be against having a black Ariel for the Little Mermaid. And I said, I'm not against having a black actress play the part. I said, I was disappointed that they made such a dramatic change in a very classic character. And they could not seem to understand, or they couldn't believe I couldn't understand that I was a racist because of that. And I said, that's not racism. I said, that's on a creative level, not liking that change. And then I made the statement like, I said, it would be kind of like having the Lion King and saying when they do they've now got the new live action remake of the Lion King where they've used all real animals. They said that would be like recasting Simba as a platypus. But it works, because platypuses have never had a job of being a Lion King before. I said, it's kind of like that. And then I got criticism for saying, oh, so now you're equating black people with platypuses. I went, oh, my dear God. Seriously? I said, seriously. Is that what you actually believe I'm saying? So there you go. And of course, I got over and over again. It's just a cartoon. It's fantasy. Mermaids have no race. So why is it? I said, you're not getting my point. I said, never mind. I said, I'm going to tell you what. I said, I'll restate it one more time. As a creative, I didn't like the fact that they creatively changed the character. I said, but you know what? I'm not going to boycott the movie or anything. I said, I'm going to take my kids to see it, and I'll bet we'll all love it. And I'll bet this young woman is going to do a fantastic job. And you know what? If she had been there first doing the job, I'd probably go, and they wanted to recast a redhead white girl in the role, I'd say, don't change the character. She's black. Leave her alone. Leave it be. Don't change it. And so there you go. How about a black guy play a plantation owner? I thought I saw a movie once or read a book a long time ago about a black slave trader, and they did exist. So it's an interesting history. So I don't know where I started with this. Oh, I know where I started. I'm talking about Tlaib. And I want to get back to that for just a second before I get into David, because I want to share this with you. Tlaib and Presley are now claiming that the Declaration of Independence is too sexist and too racist. That's what they're now saying. And I got to share with you some of the elements of this. It was on the 4th of July that they were trashing the Declaration of Independence as sexist and racist. And the freshman congresswoman both promoted a Salon article titled 4th of July's Ugly Truth Exposed. The Declaration of Independence is sexist, racist, and prejudiced. What do you think of that? Just that statement alone. And the impact of the prejudices, biases, and contradictions codified by our founding fathers is still felt today. Now, there's something you got to keep in mind when you're thinking about the Declaration of Independence. It was written in 1776. We're talking 243 years ago. And thinking was different back then. These were a group of white men. Yes, they were all British descendants for the most part, living in the colonies, that had established this Declaration of Independence from Britain because they were trying to form a new country, a new way of doing things. I've even seen some of the excerpts that they pulled out of the final draft that were more violently against slavery, but I think they pulled them because they realized most of us are slaveholders. And they pulled those things out because they were on that cusp of trying to figure out how to change the world. And most of these guys, now like Jefferson eventually freed his slaves. And as some say, he had married one or had sex with one his whole life and had children. And but Jefferson tried to do away with it. And he saw the necessity of doing away with it. And what the Declaration of Independence did, somebody said to me today, it's because it says all men are created equal. And somebody that I know that I thought was a brilliant thinker, but I know he's very leftist, he said to me something to the effect of, what they really meant was that the Declaration of Independence was for all white land-owning men. And I said, no, that's not what that meant. I said, what do you do with the phrase, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with unalienable rights? They weren't talking about men as in males. Men was a way to say humankind, mankind, men. All men are created equal. What about women's suffrage then and women's rights and sexism? And I said, it's not about sexism. The women's rights, they eventually got there. I said, but they were living in a time where none of that stuff existed before that. It was a patriarchal society. And what they did, they were brilliant, genius futurists. They wrote this stuff knowing it was going to set aflame around the world. And it has. These things don't happen overnight. Slavery took another, almost 100 years, 2 generations to get rid of, before it was declared illegal, before the Emancipation Proclamation. It took another 50 years after that for women's suffrage. And so these men knew this when they wrote this. And so, I want to do something here that I didn't plan on doing. And then we're going to get to David. Hopefully by the bottom of the hour here, we're going to get to David. But I didn't plan this. That's why I'm typing right now, because I want to read something to you. I did this on Rocky's My Show, the Situation Room, a while back. And I want you to hear this. I won't read the full thing, but this is one of the most eloquent governmental documents of its kind ever written. And you tell me here if you believe that this is sexist and racist. But here, I'm going to read this. I've done it before, but I want you to hear the words of this. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. Now, folks, if you haven't read this in a while, maybe even since junior high school, when you had to do it for school, if you haven't refreshed your memory on this, other than a couple of the phrases that are key phrases, please listen to this. Listen. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And they go on and they list all their articles and all the reasons that they are declaring this. And it wraps it up. In every stage of these oppressions, which have now been formally named, I didn't go through all those, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated positions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and I can never say this word, magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce to the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And then, of course, you have all the signers down below. So there it is. That's the Declaration of Independence. And according to Tlaib and Presley, that's sexist and racist. Now, we've already talked about how the times they lived in dictated otherwise. They did not set out to go ahead and just free all the slaves, but they saw the inconsistency in what they were doing as they were forming this country. And then they set upon the path of abolishing slavery, which happened a mere 2 generations later. So there you go, folks. This is something, when I hear that we have members of the House of Representatives, and probably even in the Senate, though they're not mentioned here. They say right here, this was, which one was this? Is this the Salon article, which was written by Matthew Rosa, attempts to partly discredit the Declaration of Independence by saying the document itself does not condemn slavery or limited women's rights. And there's a quote here: despite its overwhelmingly positive impact on history, the Declaration of Independence was also a product of its time and bears some of the shortcomings of its era, including sexism, racism, and prejudice against the Native Americans, the article partly reads. And while the piece seems to acknowledge the importance of the Declaration of Independence, it also points out that the Founding Fathers are not the living gods some believe them to be. It says here, the Declaration of Independence, was and continues to be one of the most eloquent and morally moving political documents ever penned. That said, we must also remember that our founding fathers were not the living gods that many believe them to be. They were fallible human beings, and some of their flaws had terrible consequences for people who were not fortunate enough to be born into privileged groups, the article argues. And so what have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? This 4th of July is yours, not mine. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than our people of these United States at this very hour. You know who said that? Nike representative Colin Kaepernick. So there you go, folks. You have to decide where you stand on this issue. But I am going to tell you that this document was conceived with the idea of liberty for all. And they knew they had work to do, but they needed to start somewhere to create this country. And that's what this does. And when you see an article like this, where we have two of our own representatives in our House, in our Congress, that are making statements like this about our founding documents and our founders, there is a problem with common sense. And there is a problem with history, knowing their history, understanding history. There's something I say when dealing with ancient history, and we've said it about the series I'm on with King David, which we're going to hop into in just a minute here. But sorry, I've got something going on. Something just popped up telling me all about who David is in the Bible. That's interesting. And my sound is on mute. Maybe it's just a reminder that that's what I'm supposed to be doing right now, not talking politics. I have something at the top of my nose, Rocky said. Tip of my nose, top of my nose, boogers, finger. I got something in my eye. Oh, it's my finger. Thanks, Rocky. I appreciate that. I don't know what I got in there, but hopefully it wasn't too distracting. You see anything? Do I look okay? Hair in place? All right, there we go. So thanks, Rocky. Appreciate the notice. So that's all I'm going to really say about the Declaration of Independence. I know some of you are not Americans, or at least not citizens of the United States. You're Canadian. Some of you are British. Some of you are Australian. Some of you are New Zealanders. Some of you are from other countries around the world. And I really think it's very damn cool that you're here, and I appreciate that. So this isn't about your country, but this is, I think, showing the struggle that our country is having. And for me, the kind of people that would say this about our Declaration of Independence shouldn't be working in our government. Now, we believe in the right of free speech. They can express anything they want. They can be as stupid as they want. The First Amendment guarantees the right to free speech, freedom of expression, freedom of press. They can say anything they want as long as they are not inciting violence or causing violence by their words. There are some restrictions. But I will say this: while the Constitution guarantees the right to free speech, it doesn't guarantee that people are going to think your words are stupid. So it doesn't guarantee that people have to listen. So you have the right to say it. And it's like Colin Kaepernick, who takes a knee at the. I disagreed with all of his reasons, but I support his right to express himself. That's the First Amendment right. If I've got a, if I don't fight for his right to do that, what's going to happen when it's my turn? If I want to express something and somebody wants to stop me, there's a gradualism that can be put into play. So I went to a Baptist fundamentalist conservative Bible college, as you all know. And I remember one of our civics professors in a Baptist, very Christian setting, he said, you should be willing to lay down your life. And now you got to put this in there was a bigger context, what we were talking about. But he said, you as Christians should be willing to lay down your life for the right of somebody who doesn't believe what you believe to say it freely in our country. And wow, that was the first time that concept had ever hit me between the eyes like that. Not that I'd been biased against anybody, but he said, you need to uphold your Constitution. You should be willing, not that we all have to want to go out and die for something, but he said, if you're going to die for this, you'd be willing to lay down your life for this freedom and to defend it so that even people who disagree with you have the right to express themselves, which is the opposite of what you're seeing in the political correct crowd that's out there right now. So anyway, that's enough of my pontificating for the night on this. Rocky says, you all ever notice that we can all disagree, but yet we don't get offended? This is why I love the hell out of all of you. Man, I second that, Rocky. All of you. Disagreeing is disagreeing. But when it all comes down to it, we all know what we're made of. And none of us hates each other for it. None of us are trying to convince each other that they're wrong and we're right. So, as long as you don't argue with me about it. All right, folks. There we go. You know what? I've got to segue back into David or we'll never get through this material tonight. And I'm going to tell you something. My wife, my lovely wife, Rainey, is out for the weekend. She asked me at the beginning of the week, she said, do you mind if I go out to my grandma's cottage for the weekend just to hang with my grandma and have a quiet weekend? I said, go do it. And so I got the kids here. She's out there. She actually texted me. I put it up on my Facebook. She said, there was 2 this afternoon. She said, I'm actually out on the pontoon with just the adults and no kids. And then her next post was capital letters OMG. And that's the last I heard from her today. She's like, oh my God, I am out without kids on the boat. So probably her uncles came out and her uncles' wives and they're all hanging out on the pontoon drinking beer this afternoon or something. So although you can't do that as much anymore. So there you go. Who should be your clone? Philip? I don't know if you're talking to me or Rocky or someone else. So get to Jesus now. LOL. It's David, Rocky. David, not Jesus. So here we go. I'm just gonna hop right over into David. Now, if you remember, segue, last night we were talking about the only reason I brought up my wife being gone, my kids are upstairs. They're all in bed up there watching a movie. So if you hear big thumps and bangs and screaming, you'll know I lost control. So I'm a dad alone with his kids. It's 9:30 on a Friday night. They're little kids. That's why they're in bed. So hopefully, knock on wood, they remain sane and safe up there, and I won't have to walk out on you. So there you go. Mutiny, says Shane. Shane, how you doing? Good to see you. So here we go. If I didn't say good evening to you, Jeannie, nice to see you. Melinda, good to see you. Anybody else who's in here that I missed? Philip, I think I saw you and said hello. I appreciate your being here more than you can know. That you on a Friday night would be sitting here listening to the junk I have to say means more than the world to me. All right, so let's move on. The historic David. Last night we talked about, remember how David, just a quick recap, David, the man after God's own heart, the sweet psalmist of Israel, the giant slayer, goes into Saul's service. He's anointed king, the next king by the prophet in secret, that he's someday going to take over the throne, but he's not going to take it by force. And he serves Saul. He's a warrior for Saul, fights the Philistines with Saul as one of his generals, or at least a captain, as we're told. And he so wants, according to the biblical story, Saul becomes jealous of him because he knows that David has been anointed in his place. He also knows that the people love David. And so Saul is angry. Saul tries to kill him 3 times before finally David has to flee with nothing but the shirt on his back. And then he goes out to the wilderness and he raises an army to himself of the dispossessed, those that owe taxes, those that are in debt, those who are criminals and outlaws. So he's almost becomes like a Robin Hood and his merry men out in the wilderness, the way it's painted in the biblical story. It looks very similar to that kind of a scenario. The archetypical hero, as Joseph Campbell would have written about it, the hero of 1,000 faces. And so David's out there. He starts, Saul keeps pursuing him. Twice he has the opportunity to kill Saul. Once he steals Saul's water bottle and his spear and confronts him later from the mountaintop and yells down the hill and says, "Look, I've taken this and I didn't kill you. God has anointed you. I will not take your life." And Saul says, "Oh, praise your name, David. I won't chase you anymore. And may you remember me when you become king someday." All of these scenarios happen. And then David, because he's got nowhere to go, nothing. He and his 300 men, they go and he gives his service to their enemies, the Philistines, the king Achish of the Philistines. And David gives his service, becomes what was known as the Habiru in ancient times. He's a mercenary with his band of mercenary warriors. And he says he's going to go attack the cities of Israel, well, Judah in the south. And according to the Bible, he kind of skirts that and attacks other little villages that are not part of the land of Israel, and to maintain his cover story. So much so that the king of the Philistines gives him a town, makes him a king, like a minor king, a warlord. He's got his own town. And so, in essence, David becomes non-Israelite. He's fighting for the Philistines. And the people of Israel know this. He used to work for Saul. And then, of course, we get the slow progression of how he becomes king. He acquires all these little towns in Judah, then Israel, and then Saul's death and the death of Saul's sons at the battle with the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. And David becomes king finally, and he establishes his kingdom. Now, the thing is that the biblical story, as we have all learned over the last 2 weeks of doing this, I think we're on lesson number, I've got it numbered 14. This is the 14th session on King David. And we've seen that all that David has done is actually, the story we know is an apologetic, meaning it's a glossed over story written later to make the deeds of David look better than they are, the deeds of Saul to make him look more insane than he was, all for the purpose of establishing David's kingdom and David's legacy in the history of Israel. And so we've seen that over and over and over again in this story. And now last night, there's the brief recap. Last night, we talked about how David's son Absalom kills his brother, one of David's other sons. David had 6 sons by 6 different wives. And then we have the rape of Tamar by Amnon, David's oldest son. And Absalom becomes angered with him and eventually kills him. And what we find is the apologetic is a story that's covering up that David probably had Amnon killed because Amnon was the son of the woman that David stole from Saul, Saul's first wife, when he was trying to commit his coup. That Saul, when he chased David and tried to kill him, and David went running was because David attempted a coup against Saul. One of the things you don't do, you don't sleep with the king's wife. It would show that the king was ineffectual, that he was impotent. And that was a big thing 3,000 years ago with these rulers. And so you've got this story now where it brings us up to now. We've seen the murder of Amnon. Absalom goes into forced exile to hope, and this is probably part of the plot. He comes back, but in the meantime, he starts thinking, I don't want to wait for my dad to die. You know, if you're willing to kill your own brother to prevent him from being the next heir to the throne, what's going to keep you from killing other people? Here he's looking at David now. 9 years have passed since the murder of Amnon, and Absalom still is not on the throne. So for the last couple of years now, he's been presenting himself, crowned himself king in Hebron, which is where the capital was prior to David's conquering of Jerusalem. And so, and so David is now running in fear from Absalom because Absalom has made it very clear that he is going to take over the throne. And he might not have seen Absalom's actions coming, but he knew a successful coup when he saw one, remember, because he tried to do it himself. And in one fell swoop, everything that David had built, the new capital in Jerusalem, the new cult of Yahweh, that when he imported the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle of the Covenant from Shiloh and brought them to Mount Moriah, where the temple once stood and now the Dome of the Rock, he established all of this royal cult of Yahweh, Jehovah worship. And so here he's now seeing everything threatened. It's all going away because of Absalom. And Absalom is raising people to fight for him. And this all ends with David fleeing into the wilderness. And by entering the wilderness, David recognized that for the first time in many years, he's right back where he started when he fled from Saul, and that he was absolutely powerless against his son and the popularity his son was gaining. And that brings us to tonight. So this sensation was driven home by the sudden appearance of a man named Shimei in a small village to the east of Jerusalem. Now, Shimei threw stones at David and his men, shouting at him, Yahweh is returning upon all of you, all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you rule. That's in 2 Samuel 16. Here's one guy calling it like it is, and it's right there in the narrative. And he starts throwing rocks at David and his men. And as David and his men continued to walk by as they're leaving Jerusalem, Shimei continues to insult him and throw stones and dirt. And David of old hardly would have tolerated this kind of outrageous behavior, as his warrior Abishai reminded him, why let that dead dog curse my lord the king? That's in 2 Samuel 16:9. But David understood that he was in no position to fight back. The people had turned against him. And Shimei was merely their mouthpiece, and David had been rejected. But the focus for the moment was on the rise of the new king, Absalom. And to kill Shimei would be to arouse the wrath of the nation against David. And it was far better, he thought, to take the abuse and flee in relative safety. Remember, this is David, who by force made himself king in Judah, then made himself king in Israel, united the kingdoms, moved his capital to the newly conquered Jerusalem, reestablished the worship of Jehovah there. David's got everything he's been pushing for years, and now it's all gone in one moment. And so Shimei's results do more than prove David's powerlessness. They confirm for us David's role in the deaths of Saul and his descendants, which has been glossed over in the apologetic account of David, that confirms that he did it. Shimei's speech is the historical truth that the biblical authors have tried to counter with the apologetic. That his words have been preserved even by these same authors is explainable by the situation. Unlike many of the stories and the conversations that we've identified as apocryphal, Shimei leveled his charges against David publicly, and therefore undeniably And what I meant by apocryphally, these are all the things that we have no idea that these things actually took place in a lot of these stories. And that's how you know it's apologetic. Nobody could have known that. Nobody would have known that unless somebody was there writing it all down and put it all down in the account. Private conversations, plottings, murders, all of these things. And yet this guy did this publicly and everybody saw it and everybody heard it. So it couldn't be denied. So Shimei says what everybody must have known and been thinking for a very long time, that David had no right to the throne of Israel. The glorious King David had no right to the throne. And that he murdered Saul and all the other Saulids in cold blood to achieve the kingship. And it's no wonder that the people sided with Absalom. Now, Absalom's David's son, but Absalom didn't commit these acts. Anyone was preferable to David. The people just started flocking to Absalom. And anyone was preferable to David against whom they had harbored this deep-seated hatred every moment that he sat on the throne, because he was not the rightful king. He took the kingship. So as David leaves Jerusalem for the wilderness, Absalom arrives in the capital to formally take up his new kingship over Israel. And the first man he encounters is Hushai, David's trusted advisor. Remember him from last night? David leaves him there and says, you stay here. Say you're defecting to Absalom, that you hate my guts, and be my spy. And he's the old advisor to David. So Hushai claims Absalom is king, but Absalom is already pretty rightfully wary of the guy. Hushai convinces him, however, I'm the one, I am for the one whom Yahweh and his people and all the men of Israel have chosen. That's who I'm for. Whoever God has chosen, I'm for him. And this speech is telling. David is also said to have been chosen by Yahweh to rule, but nowhere is it said that the people of Israel chose David as their king. This is the difference between Absalom's now usurped kingship and David's. This is why Absalom's coup was a success. The people's voice was heard for the first time since David went to Hebron. And Hushai's speech was convincing, for Absalom allowed him to remain in Jerusalem as one of his counselors. Now imagine this, folks. This is the David that if you went to church, Sunday school, synagogue, whatever, you grew up knowing who this guy was about. Did you know any of this stuff about him? Did you realize what's going on here? So what you've got going on here is a very different David, as it was, I think it was, who was it? Was it you, Jeannie, last night, who said, dude was a scoundrel, worse than a scoundrel. David, this glorious king of Israel, is not who we thought he was. And there's a huge apology written over him in order for Israel to establish him. After all, his son, who does take the throne later after David's death, Solomon, the greatest king to ever sit on Israel's throne. So, and that's going to, there, I just kind of let the cat out of the bag, as Absalom doesn't stay king for very long. So let's go back into this. Just imagine, this is the David that you thought you knew. So the final act of Absalom's coup was one that we recognize. Absalom slept with the concubines whom David had left behind in the palace. Remember, he left 9 of them behind? 9 of David's, if I can be so bold and so nasty as to say, the royal whores, they were the concubines of the king. He left 9 of them behind in the palace. And what does Absalom do? He's like, yeah, boom, chicka, bum, bum, da. He's getting it on with David's concubines. And why is he doing this? Maybe some of them were hot. Maybe it was like, yeah, baby, come on. Maybe it was just because, and I got to think a royal concubine has probably got to be good looking by public standards. So concubines weren't royal weddings. So they were there to have sex with the king when he wanted it. And so something that probably many men wish still, I wish we could still have concubines, honey. I'm sorry, dear. I didn't mean that. So the final act was to sleep with these women. So what's he doing? He's doing what David did to Saul's wife, Ahinoam, with whom he had his first son. He was showing the ineffectual rule, the absolute what's the word? I'm not ineffectual. Not sterile. Impotent is the word I'm looking for. The impotence of the king, and that you are stronger, more powerful than him because you can take the women he sleeps with. And so this was in fulfillment of the second part of Nathan's punishment for David's affair with Bathsheba. By the way, the Bathsheba thing took place before this. We just skipped over it for now. So what Nathan said is, I'm going to take your wives and will give them to another man before your very eyes, and he shall sleep with your wives under this very sun. That's what the prophet said to Samuel, or to David in 2 Samuel. And so what David had tried and failed at in his own coup against Saul, Absalom accomplished with ease. Remember Absalom, what did they say about him? Tall, good looking. He had long, flowing hair. He used to go to the marketplace, and we'll talk about this in a minute. Go to the marketplace and show off his hair. He'd weigh his hair. So he had these big, probably dreadlocky, biggie things of hair. And he said he had beautiful eyes. He was beautiful to look upon. So women probably dug him. Now, by now, he's no young man, relatively speaking. If he plotted with his dad, David to kill Amnon, and at least 11 years have passed now since that murder. So he's got to be at least in his 30s. So Absalom accomplished this with ease. David's downfall was complete. The entire nation now knew that David's power had absolutely vanished, and Absalom was now the unquestioned monarch in David's place. So Absalom was truly his father's son, wasn't he? Like David, he knew precisely how to go about achieving his desired results. I mean, just look who raised him. Well, I don't know how often David was in his life. For 9 years at least, they were apart in his adult life. But David's son is just like David. And so just as David had slowly gathered power, taking a series of these well-calculated steps to become the king, so too Absalom. His chariots, his horses, his promises of justice, his call to the populace to join them. Remember when he was issuing justice at the gates before the coup? Rather than have people bow to them, he said, you come, and he puts his arms around them, kisses them on the neck, hugs them. This is the king. This is what he wanted people to believe about him. And now he didn't make the same mistake as his father. He had all of his father's political gifts, including unvarnished ambition, and he added to them a sensitivity to the desires of the people. God, what would it be like to have a king that was manipulative but ruthless, brilliant, genius, tactician, yet he had a heart of gold to the people. He loved the people, and the people loved him back. It'd be an interesting ruler, wouldn't it? These were the people that were going to be his subjects. And the combination of all of this together was absolutely unstoppable in Absalom. But he has his downfall. Only one thing was left for Absalom to do. To cement his place on the throne, he had to do what? David still existed. And he's kind of the rightful king because he had taken over. But now Absalom, what's he got to do? He needs to eliminate David, his dad. So as David knew when he murdered Saul's descendants, it was impossible to rule in security when another legitimate claimant for the kingship was still alive. Eliminating David was the only way for Absalom to be certain that his father would not one day try to take back the throne. He'd have to have eyes in the back of his head, and every night he went to sleep, he had to be afraid that somebody was going to slit his throat in his sleep. And Absalom could be sure that David wouldn't rest until he'd regained control of that throne. And David had already invested far too much in gaining the kingship to let it go so easily. So David's not this poor guy who lost his throne. David is this guy now. Wow. David is this guy now who, sorry about that, my coffee mug stuck to my desk. I will, as an aside, everything here, my whole radio thing is set up on my big drafting table, my art table. And when I bought this used from an old art shop, and they have some kind of sticky surface on it that's kind of gradually worn down, but it's for the purpose of laying things down, working them so they don't slide all over on you. Sometimes I still put my coffee mug over here, and I reach for it when we're on the radio, and I sometimes splash coffee all over myself because it jerks loose and free. So that's what happened there. Sorry about that little aside into, what would you call it, normalcy? Normalcy, mundanity. That's the word I was looking for. So here's David. He's already invested too much in this throne. He's going to do whatever he can to get that throne back. So considering David's state, with only a few hundred men by his side, all weary from flight, capturing and killing him shouldn't have been a particularly difficult task. Absalom had the resources to pursue David, and a quick strike with an overwhelming force, an ancient campaign of shock and awe, David's men would be unable to resist anything that Absalom had thrown at their way. This, in fact, seems to be precisely what Ahithophel, Absalom's chief advisor, recommended. Ahithophel even offered to lead the charge in Absalom's stead, guaranteeing David's death at his own hands. Now, mind you, this has got to be right away. David's left the city. Now Absalom's come with his entourage, his army, and all that. Now they're going to go out and find David because they're already in flight. They're going to find him. But Absalom wavered only one time, and it ends up being his fatal mistake in his coup. He asks to hear also from Hushai, David's spy counselor that is now in the service of Absalom. And here David's sole advantage over Absalom, his web of loyal servants, those who had been with him, benefited from his patronage for so many years, his close, tight circle came into play. Hushai was left behind for this exact reason, to provide Absalom with harmful advice. And Hushai played his part beautifully. The plan he suggested sounded perfectly reasonable. Remembering that David was at his best in the wilderness, he said, it'd be safer to call up troops from all the tribes, as many as possible, and attack him in an orderly fashion, leaving, in theory, no room for error. Remember, David knows the hills. He knows the wilderness. He's Robin Hood. And so he says, you got to face him in open conflict. And there was only one catch. If the tribes were all to be mustered for war, then their new commander-in-chief would have to march at their head. And who's the new commander-in-chief? Absalom. And so there were many reasons for Absalom to like Hushai's plan. He could take up the traditional royal role of military leader. He could physically stand before his people as their king, and he could personally ensure that Dad, David, was really dead. Hushai's argument was convincing, but in accepting it, Absalom sealed his fate. So, with Hushai's plan in place, David's spy network went into action. Hushai passed the word to David's priests. Oh, isn't this exciting? It's like watching a movie. I love this stuff. With Hushai's plan in place, David's spy network kicks in. Hushai passed the word to the priests, Zadok and Abiathar, who David had also left behind with the ark. And they passed it on to the slave girl, who related to Zadok and Abiathar's sons, Ahimaaz and Jonathan, respectively. These latter two were staying at a spring just outside the eastern walls of the city of David. Probably the Gihon spring. Not Gihon, might be the Gihon. It's where the pool of Bethesda was. Who in Jesus' time, remember, if you went down to the pool and you touched the water while the water was rushing, it meant that there were angels there and you could be healed of disease. This is the same place. That pool still is there today, by the way. The ancient pool, it still is fed by the Gihon spring. So so anyway, this is probably where they are, and they were staying outside the walls at this spring, and they ran the news to David in the wilderness. The instructions. Now, you see that network? It went like this: Hushai to the priests Zadok and Abiathar, who passed it on to the slave girl, who related to Zadok and Abiathar's sons, Ahimaaz and Jonathan. And they were at the spring, and they ran the news to David in the wilderness. There's this little network in the palace of David's. And so David had to get out of the wilderness and across the Jordan River. So David did, arriving at the city of Mahanaim. Boom. Why did David have to cross the Jordan River? Because under Hushai's plan, he would be pursued not only by a selection of troops, but by the amassed forces of all the Israelite tribes. I don't know if you heard that. I did. What are you doing up there? I pause for a moment. I don't hear any screaming. I just heard this big wham on the kid's bedroom above my head. Then wham again. I think things are okay. All right. So Brian asks, who would I compare with David today? Oh, boy. I don't know that there's anybody that's like David today. Somebody who connived their way to the throne, killed everybody on the way, manipulated everything. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if they're wrestling up there. I don't hear anybody screaming, and nobody's running down the stairs to get me. So either all three of them died in one big catastrophe up there, or what? I don't know what it is. So I think it's good. I hear moving. Maybe that's just them in their death throes beneath the bookcase that fell on them all, or something like that. Boy, that's death of a family in biblical proportions, isn't it? And all of Job's sons and daughters were gathered for a feast, and a hurricane hit, and the house toppled and killed them all. Yeah, the twitching upstairs. All right, hang on, folks. Give me an intermission. Give me 2 minutes. I'm just going to see if everybody's alive. Hang on. Hey, guys. Flip. What's going on up there? What was the big bang? No, I'm on the radio. I walked away. Guys, none of that. All right? Daddy's still on the radio. You go upstairs. Get in bed. All right. Go to bed. Sorry about that little familial pause. Everybody's alive. My son came out of his room and said, "What, Dad?" Then the two little girls came out, the 7-year-old and the 4-year-old. And Dad, Ellie punched the screen out of the window. It's down on the ground outside. I'm like, what the hell are you doing at the window? Air conditioning's on. Why is the window open? Why is the screen out of the window? Do you know you could fall out of the window and die? Or worse, become a paraplegic and mom and dad would have to watch you and feed you and change your diapers until you're 80? Sweet Jesus. All right. So there we go. Blink, blink. Yeah, blank stare, Susie. There it is. House is intact. Kids are alive. Sorry for the unplanned intermission, but there we go. All right. I already looked at my young daughter, who I love. She is so sweet and so cute. Dad, I punched the screen out of the window. That's what I did. And I looked at her and I said, you took the screen out of the window and threw it on the ground? I said, that's trouble. She went, I'm sorry, Dad. I'll go back to bed now. I said, good night. I love you. And sometimes as parents, you just have to go, oh my God. You try to not laugh because we did the same shit when we were kids. All I just don't need is watching a child drop by my window from upstairs. It's not going to happen. But there you go. You know what I'm talking about, parents. All right, let's get back in it here. Can't remember exactly what I was saying, but Hushai's plan's in place. David crossed the Jordan because of all the grouping Israelite tribes. Remember, there was this one significant non-Israelite territory that David had authentically managed to subjugate, and it was to the east across the Jordan River. It was to these vassals that David went when he fled, and they dutifully supplied him and his men with food and a place to rest. So he's got somebody who's loyal to them. Guess who? Non-Israelites, loyal to David, the king. So this may, however, have had less to do with their treaty obligations to David. After all, he was no longer the king, and rather more to do with the fact that he and hundreds of his best soldiers had just arrived at their door requesting provisions. Remember Nabal? So whatever the reason, the Transjordanian supplies probably made a significant difference for David. And if they hadn't been there, he might have had some big problems on his hand. And more important, David's move across the Jordan River shifted the field of battle out of Israel and into a terrain that David knew better than anyone else that's coming after him. And so the battle's described very briefly in the Bible. David split his men into 3 divisions, one under Joab, one under Abishai, Joab's brother, and one under Ittai, the Philistine. Now, David himself remained away from the field of battle for his safety, as Absalom, in his pride, didn't. He wanted to be out on the field. Remember? The long flowing mane of hair. All right? So, Absalom and his forces, the army assembled from the various Israelite tribes, as per Hushai's advice, engaged David's men. Much of David's military success over the years, by the way, if you remember, started back in his days as an officer under Saul and was predicated on the advantages he gained from the terrain. And this battle was no different. The 2 sides met in the forest of Mahanaim. It's Mahannaim. Manaim, maybe you could say it. Maybe the AHA is just So Mahanaim. Okay, whatever. So it's difficult enough for a regular trained military company to maintain order and position when fighting in the woods. So Absalom's army, a patchwork of men, convened from the various Israelite tribes. And remember, he's just newly the king now. Virtually none of whom had any battle experience or practice fighting alongside one another, was undone by the landscape. David's men had been together for years and fought together. They're like this band of brothers fighting against this ragtag new army of Absalom, the usurpers. So David's men were well trained. They'd fought together for all these years. They had experience, particularly in the hills of Judah and the forests, and Judah and the Transjordan, which, by the way, now is a very different looking terrain than it was then. It was a little greener back then. So the biblical authors put it aptly. In 2 Samuel 18:8, they say, the forest consumed more troops that day than the sword. That's interesting. So now there's something very symbolic about David's victory in Mahanaim. Absalom's rebellion was grounded in popular appeal, a promise to return to Israel to its old ways before David came to the throne. Yet when it came to the military matters, this battle proved that the old ways of each tribe contributing men to the fight together against a common cause were no match for the royal militia of the centralized monarchy. If Absalom's revolt pitted populism against elitism, it was the elite who came out on top in the woods. So for Absalom, the biblical description of his death is highly literary. We're told that he's riding his horse fleeing from the battle scene, and that his long hair got caught in a branch, low-hanging branch. And when his mule rode out from under him, he was left hanging in midair by his hair, dangling in this tree. And it was while Absalom was in this very unroyal position that Joab supposedly came upon him and stabbed him in the chest with a javelin and covered the pit with stones. Now, the last part of the story, Absalom's death and ignominious burial, seems plausible enough. But the dangling in midair by his hair is the biblical author's way of communicating Absalom's comeuppance. His beauty, which is implied, had something to do with his popularity and perhaps his desire for the throne. The hair, the weighing of his hair, the doing this in public in the marketplace, and all the chicks oohing and awing over him, as the Bible story says earlier. It was this very thing that had to do with his popularity that led to his downfall. It's a lesson. It's a morality play, not a history lesson. Exactly how Absalom died, we don't really know. We just have that story in the Bible. But it's as likely as not that Joab personally made sure that Absalom was dead, because he's the one who killed him in the story. He's probably the one who killed him or made sure he was dead. So David's reaction to hearing the news, I remember reading this story when I was younger, and it's a sad story, because if you're a dad, I read this before I was even a dad, but imagine being a dad or a parent and you learn that your son has died. Even though you killed one of your other kids. Let's push that aside for a second, because we didn't really know that at the time when I learned this story. David's reaction to hearing the news of Absalom's death is among the most famous parts of the biblical story of David. He says, "My son Absalom, oh my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, oh Absalom, my son, my son." And he drops to the ground and he rips his garment and throws ashes and dust on his head, and he weeps. And no reader, especially one with children, can help but be moved by David's cries. This is perhaps the emotional high water mark of the entire Bible, among the most authentic representations of grief in all of ancient literature. And its emotional authenticity, it rings absolutely true. After all, David really did want Absalom to succeed him. He was truly shocked by this revolt of his own son. And thus, he very well may have been devastated by the news of Absalom's death. He was shocked by this, but I'll bet you in his heart of hearts, he said, I know what my son's doing. Maybe I can win him back. Maybe this will all, you know how you think as a parent. But this is one of the most authentic displays of grief. And yet David surely knew that one of them, either he or his son, would die as a result of this battle. David understood why Absalom was pursuing him. He knew Absalom couldn't allow him to live. But by the very same logic, if David were ever to reclaim his throne, Absalom had to be eliminated. And it's therefore curious that the biblical authors maintain otherwise, that David explicitly requested that Absalom not be killed. He says to his general, Joab, his cousin, don't kill my son Absalom when they're going into battle. More telling is the way they describe this request. David told Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, his three generals, pardon my spitting, means I'm enunciating properly, to deal gently for my sake with the boy with Absalom, 2 Samuel 18 says. And crucially, he said all the people heard when the king gave the order about Absalom to all the officers. And we've seen this type of statement before. It's similar to what the Bible authors said about the death of Abner. All the people and all Israel knew that it had not been the king's will to kill Abner, son of Ner. That's 2 Samuel 3. Same kind of phraseology. When the Bible authors say that everyone in the narrative knows something, what they are really communicating is that we, the audience, should accept it as absolute truth. And as often happens when the Bible wants to persuade the reader, the point is hammered home over and over again for emphasis. The first man to encounter Absalom hanging by his hair refuses to kill him because of David's word. The two messengers who bring news of the battle to David are each greeted with the question, is my boy Absalom? He says, is my boy Absalom safe? And you look at this, I'm trying to articulate this the right way. As a parent, it breaks your heart. Is my boy Absalom safe? And David continues crying as the troops return from the combat, and the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the troops, says 2 Samuel. David is represented as caring virtually nothing for the result of the battle. He doesn't care. The battle that would determine his fate, whether he would die or return to the throne, but only about the preservation of his son. If that is not a moving historical story, I don't know what is. This I don't think is literary. This I think is real. So David's mourning continues so long, according to the Bible, that Joab has to intervene and put an end to the mourning. He castigates David for seeming to care more about Absalom than about all the soldiers who fought so bravely for him and for his own kingship. He threatens David, suggesting that if the king refuses to present himself to the troops, they're going to abandon you. And so David, very reluctantly, the Bible implies, he stops mourning, stands before his men as the victor. And this episode is the conclusion of the apology regarding Absalom's death. It claims that David was so distraught over his son's demise that he would have been willing to relinquish even the kingship just to grieve. And this is pretty moving stuff, but it hardly sounds like the David we've come to know. So Joab's significant involvement in the story should be a clue for us as to what may have been happening. As almost every point where Joab appears, the biblical authors position him as the counter to David's desires. It's not David who wanted Abner dead. It's Joab. It's not David who killed Abner. It's Joab. It's not David who wanted Absalom to return from exile. It was Joab. And it was not David who brought him back. It was Joab. So too here. It's not David who wanted Absalom dead. It's Joab. And it was not David who recognized the great victory he'd won over Absalom. It was Joab. So Joab has become this central element to the pro-David apology that we're examining. As the biblical authors, historical events that incriminated David were deflected onto Joab. The authors have David himself say, those men, the sons of Zeruiah, Joab's mother, are too savage for me. In effect, the authors are saying that David was constitutionally incapable of doing the things it appears that he did. It must have been his cruel general. And yet the authors could do nothing about the fact that Joab not only went unpunished, but remained David's right-hand man throughout the rest of his reign. What this tells us is that the case of Absalom, despite the high emotion of the episode, the truth is that David ordered Absalom's death. David did it. Indeed, he had no other choice. He may well have been saddened by it and grieving and struck down and ripping his heart out over it, but he knew he had to do it. And he may well have mourned in this very way that it's written, but he was responsible. Imagine all that emotion that we're talking about that he expresses, yet he is the one that orders it. I have to kill my son in order to maintain my throne and to keep myself from being killed. So I think this is what you have going on here. Maybe Joab wanted to be king. Yeah, maybe. So this story goes on. An intriguing question is why the biblical authors felt the need to persuade us that the opposite was true. After all, it would make perfect sense for David to defend himself even to the death. There seems to be little here to apologize for. The best guess is that at the time the biblical authors were writing their David story, substantial pro-Absalom feelings remained among Israel's populace, the audience for the narrative. And so the thrust of the apology is that David would have allowed Absalom to live if he could, and we may assume, to take the throne either in David's place or after him. And David, as his own words said, I would have died for thee. He says, oh, Absalom, I would have died for thee. And the biblical authors are proclaiming that the loss of Absalom as Israel's desired king is not to be blamed on David, their actual king. Such a claim would make no sense generations later when the memory of Absalom, the momentary monarch, had faded in Israel. The Absalom apology thus serves as another indication that the David story should be dated to a time very close to David's own. So it was probably David, as I mentioned a couple of times, who had this glossed over version of his life written. Or it was right after his reign. So Absalom's coup, though a failure, dealt a severe blow to David, as regarding both his power and his image. David had clawed his way to the top using every possible advantage he could find, destroying lives and traditions without regard or remorse. He controlled the nation as no one before him had ever controlled Israel. And yet it all came undone. The mighty king forced into the wilderness and then out of the country altogether, in need of foreign assistance to defend himself against his own former subjects and his own kid. David would return to his throne in Jerusalem, but his reign would never be the same. And there's an aftermath to all of this, kind of a falling action, and I thought we'd get there tonight, and I took a little too much time maybe on politics at the beginning tonight, but see, I could go into this, and it would take us about another half an hour to get through this, the end of this. So when you look at this whole story of David, you see the real monarch coming through. And while he may have been a wicked man, he may have been really a very ruthless, unlikable person compared to the story we know about him. I think the one truth was that he loved his son, and it killed him to have to do what he did. But he was behind it because he couldn't let his son live. I could not imagine being in that position where you would have to take the life of your own child despite loving them immensely. So, yeah, there's big aftershocks with David. So our own Audrey is out there. Let's keep her in our thoughts. Where's Audrey? Did I miss something? What happened to Audrey? Anyway, yes, Audrey will have abundant favor. So she's in California. Yeah. She's out there now. Not sure, Scotty. Oh, I wasn't sure. Sorry. Hate to be confusing. I just saw talk about Audrey. Was something happen? Is Audrey out somewhere? Anyway, she's out there somewhere. I got it. So there you go. So there's the story. I think that's all the further I'm going to take it tonight. It's been an hour and a half. I could go on for another half an hour and finish this all off. This is just the kind of the falling action to Absalom's rebellion. And right after this, we're going to go into, in the next lesson, David in decline. And we're going to go into the Bathsheba story. David and Bathsheba. Very familiar to most everybody. And if you don't know it, you've heard it in you remember the song, and I think I mentioned this, the Leonard Cohen song, Hallelujah. We heard it, really got big popularized in Shrek, when Shrek came out. But that song, Leonard Cohen said that, that's okay, Lewis. Leonard Cohen said that, earthquake in Southern California. Well, hopefully Audrey and everyone's okay. So Leonard Cohen's song, Hallelujah, that originally had 19 verses to it. And Cohen said he stayed up all night, maybe even 2 nights, in a hotel room on the floor writing these verses. He wrote many, many other verses than that. But he wrote one of the verses. It said, your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the roof. Her beauty in the moonlight overtook you, or overthrew you. She tied you to a kitchen chair. She broke your throne. She cut your hair. And from your lips she drew the hallelujah. That's all about David. And of course, he mixes in a few cutting your hair, Samson, so on, things like that. The taking away of power. But this is that story of David and Bathsheba. He's out on the roof and he sees her bathing from his rooftop. And calls her in, has sex with her. I don't think he raped her. I think it was a genuine thing. But who's going to refuse the king? It's good to be king. And then he has her husband murdered. And then they have a child together. The child dies. And then her son, second son with David, is none other than Solomon. And there's some interesting things about that as well. So I like the way Cohen sings it too. Beautiful song. So that's what we'll talk about. Tomorrow, we're going to hit the falling action of this. It's going to be the aftermath of Absalom. And then we'll start touching on David and Bathsheba and that story and what happens as a result of that. Even though it gives us Solomon, what happens. And David's kingdom and his kingship, he's in decline after this. It doesn't crumble apart on him. He dies king. But there's still a lot to go on this story of David. And Bible study, says Johan, dancing gypsy. I will say, my wife said to me the other day, she says, are you doing your Sunday school thing again on the radio? She was being a little flippant. And she, your Bible thing. And I said, I don't see this as a Bible study. I see this as the study of a real historical character who was part of the biblical narrative, and how we're looking at the biblical narrative and seeing how the story was an apologetic of the real guy. And it's how this is all about the real life history and story of an invented hero. So there you go, folks. That's it for tonight. I hope it gives you something a little deeper to go on. That it lets you know that there's more to this than meets the eye. These are some of the things that made me say, things aren't what I thought they were. So there you have it. And if a story and account like this can be an apologetic and not be true, what else do I look at in the scripture and say, that's just not the way I was taught? So we'll leave it there. Good story tonight. Good action story. That's why they made so many different movies of the life of David. Do you know Richard Gere played King David in the movie aptly titled King David? Came out in like 1982 or 3, something like that. Maybe 1985. And I think quintessentially, Richard Gere made a fantastic David. But he's not the David of this apologetic. He's the David of the biblical story with a little bit of the stuff in there. A little bit of twists and turns in there. The movie was not accepted well, I think, because it was a little bit before its time and as it strayed a bit too much from the biblical narrative. Well worth seeing, though. I even had one of my old seminary professors said, for as bad as that movie was, biblically speaking, he's talking from a biblical point of view, he said it was fantastic as far as the way it looked and the way it felt, the gritty realism of being there in the day. So you want to see a good movie, go find, it's hard to find. You got to pay for it on Netflix or Amazon or one of those, even $3.99 or something. Well worth taking your time this weekend and watch that movie. It's a good movie. Alice Krige, by the way, plays Bathsheba in that movie. Alice Krige, if you don't know who I'm talking about, if you're a Star Trek fan, she was the Borg Queen in the original movie that showed the Borg Queen. I can't remember which movie that was. The one where they go back in time to Earth, and she's in that one. That's Alice Krige. She played Bathsheba to Richard Gere's David, and so you'd probably really like it. Yeah, I used to do a pretty fair Sean Connery. It's good to be the king. I don't have the to it anymore. At least not at the moment. I'd have to work it out. So anyway, there we go. I'm done. It's the long goodbye as usual. Go see my website. Go pick up the shirt that I made up that's commemorating this series, my King David shirt. I love the art I did for it. I think you'll really like it. It's cool. It's not a Bible-looking shirt at all. Professor Bauer actually said to me, he said, whoa. He says, that's some serious imagery you got going there, something like that. And so go take a look at it. And thanks for being here. Means a lot to me. More than you know. And I will see you here not tomorrow night, not Sunday night, but Monday night. We'll be back. Have a good weekend. And thanks again. Good night, folks.